The late 1950s in rural America was a world apart from the bustling cities. It was a time when life moved slower, dictated by the seasons and the rhythm of the land. Small towns dotted the landscape, connected by dusty two-lane highways that stretched for miles through open fields and rolling hills. The air often smelled of fresh-cut hay, pine needles, or distant rain. These were places where everyone knew everyone, where a handshake still sealed a deal, and where the nearest neighbor might be a good 20-minute drive away. The quietude was profound, broken only by the chirping of crickets, the lowing of cattle, or the distant rumble of a passing train. In these communities, self-reliance wasn't just a virtue, it was a necessity. People pulled together when times were tough, whether it was helping a neighbor with a harvest or searching for a lost child. But the landscape itself presented its own set of challenges. Vast, untamed wilderness lay just beyond the cultivated fields, dense forests, deep canyons, and winding rivers that could swallow a person whole if they weren't careful. It was a beautiful but unforgiving place, a testament to both the resilience of the people who lived there and the raw power of nature. It was in this world, specifically in a ranching community nestled against the foothills of a rugged mountain range, that our story begins. His name was Arthur Finch, and in 1958 he was a man in his late 50s. Arthur wasn't the kind of man who drew much attention to himself. He was sturdy, with hands calloused from years of working the land, and a face weathered by sun and wind. His hair was mostly grey, but he still had a quiet strength in his eyes. He was known around town as a dependable man, a good neighbor, and a fair dealer. Nobody ever heard Arthur complain, and he always kept his word. His ranch, the Lazy F, had been in his family for 3 generations, and he ran it with a quiet efficiency that earned him respect from everyone who knew him. Arthur's days followed a predictable pattern. He was up before dawn, tending to his cattle, mending fences or checking irrigation lines. His mornings were for the hard physical labor that kept the ranch going. Afternoons might involve a trip into town for supplies, a quick chat with the folks at the general store, or perhaps a stop at the diner for a cup of coffee and a slice of pie. He wasn't a recluse, but he wasn't overly social either. He had a few close friends, mostly other ranchers, and he valued their company. His routine was his anchor, a reflection of his steady nature. He had family, 2, a sister living a few towns over, and a couple of nephews he saw at holidays. Nothing complicated, just the usual ties that bound a man to his community and his blood. The last time anyone saw Arthur Finch was on a Tuesday in early October 1958. The air was crisp, hinting at the coming winter, and the leaves were just starting to turn. It was around 10:30 in the morning when he pulled his old Ford pickup truck up to the feed store in town. He needed a few bags of feed for his cattle and some new fencing wire. Frank Miller, the owner of the feed store, was the last person to speak with him. "Morning, Arthur," Frank said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Got that special blend you like in stock?" Arthur nodded, a small smile on his face. "Good to hear, Frank. The cows have been looking forward to it." They exchanged a few more words about the weather and the price of beef, the usual pleasantries. Arthur paid in cash, loaded the feed and wire into the back of his truck, and then got back behind the wheel. "See you next week, Arthur," Frank called out as the truck idled. "You bet, Frank," Arthur replied, giving a slight wave before pulling out of the parking lot and heading west towards his ranch. He was going back to work, as he always did. There was nothing unusual about the encounter, nothing to suggest that this ordinary Tuesday morning would be the last time anyone would see Arthur Finch. He had no special plans, no big trip, no reason to deviate from his routine. He was simply going home to his ranch, to the life he had built and cherished. For a man like Arthur, a day or two without contact wasn't immediately alarming. He was known for getting absorbed in his work, sometimes staying out on the far pastures, away from any phone line. He was a man of the land, and the land often demanded his full attention. So, when he didn't show up in town the next day, or the day after that, people didn't immediately jump to conclusions. But the quiet hum of the community was about to change. The quiet hum of the community did change. 2 days turned into 4, and then a full week had passed since Frank Miller last saw Arthur Finch. Arthur's closest neighbor, an older woman named Martha Gable, started to feel a growing unease. She usually saw Arthur's truck pass her farm on its way to town, or she'd hear the distant lowing of his cattle. For a few days, she just thought he was busy, maybe out on a far pasture, as he sometimes was. But the silence from his property became too heavy. The cattle were still there. She could see them from her kitchen window, but they seemed less attended. No smoke from his chimney in the evenings, no lights in his windows after dark. Martha, a practical woman not given to dramatics, decided to call Arthur's sister, Eleanor. Eleanor lived about 50 miles away and hadn't heard from Arthur either, which wasn't unusual for them. Their relationship was steady but not overly communicative. Still, Martha's call planted a seed of worry in Eleanor's mind. She tried calling Arthur's ranch, but the phone just rang and rang, an empty sound echoing in the silence. It was around the 10th day of Arthur's absence that the informal inquiries began. Martha called a couple of other ranchers, men who knew Arthur well. They agreed it was odd for him to be gone this long without a word. One of them, a gruff but kind man named Gus, decided to drive over to Arthur's ranch to check things out. He found the gate open, which wasn't unusual, but the house was locked up tight, no sign of forced entry. The barn was quiet. His dog, an old border collie named Blue, was there, looking thin and hungry, but otherwise fine. Gus fed Blue and left a note on the door, but Arthur was nowhere to be found. This confirmed what Martha and Eleanor already suspected. Something was wrong. The decision to alert local authorities didn't come lightly. In a small town like theirs, calling the sheriff was a serious step, usually reserved for more clear-cut emergencies. But after nearly 2 weeks, with no word and no sign of Arthur, Eleanor finally made the call. Sheriff Brody, a man who knew everyone in the county by name, listened carefully. He knew Arthur Finch, knew him to be a man who kept to himself, but was reliable. This wasn't like him. Filing a missing person report in 1958 was a much simpler, less bureaucratic process than it is today. There were no national databases, no Amber Alerts. It was mostly about local knowledge and shoe leather. Sheriff Brody took down the details. Arthur's description, the last known sighting, and the fact that his truck was also missing. The limited resources available to rural law enforcement meant that a full-scale search couldn't be launched immediately. Brody had 2 deputies, a small office, and a lot of ground to cover. The first days of the official search were community-led. News traveled fast through the small town. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers who simply knew Arthur's name gathered at his ranch. They organized into small groups, fanning out across his property and the surrounding areas. They rode horses, drove their own pickups, and walked through the brush. They focused on the immediate vicinity of his ranch, the pastures, the creek beds, the common travel routes he might have taken. They searched the dirt roads and the few paved ones that crisscrossed the county. The challenges were immense. This was a vast, undeveloped rural landscape. There were no cell phones to coordinate, no GPS to track their movements. Maps were often basic, and much of the navigation relied on local knowledge of landmarks. The weather, still mild in early October, could change quickly. The terrain was rough in places, with hidden ravines and thickets of mesquite. Everyone had a flashlight, but once night fell, the search effectively stopped until dawn. They called out his name, hoping for an answer. They looked for anything, a hat, a dropped tool, a sign of a struggle, a tire track that wasn't supposed to be there. But day after day, nothing. No immediate clues, no evidence. The initial searches yielded nothing but tired, disheartened volunteers. The air, once crisp with the promise of autumn, now carried a heavier weight, a silent question that hung over the entire community. Where was Arthur Finch? The silence from the ranch was no longer just Martha Gable's concern. It had become the concern of an entire county. People started to talk, not just about Arthur, but about the vastness of the land, and how easily a man could simply disappear into it. The fear began to settle in, a cold, creeping sensation that something truly bad had happened. And yet there was no body, no wreckage, no sign, just an empty ranch, a worried dog, and an old pickup truck that was nowhere to be found. The days stretched into weeks, each one deepening the mystery surrounding Arthur Finch's disappearance. The initial flurry of community-led searches had dwindled, not from lack of care, but from sheer exhaustion and the crushing weight of futility. Hope, that fragile thing, was slowly giving way to a gnawing despair. Sheriff Brody and his deputies continued their patrols, asking questions, but without a concrete lead. Their efforts felt like searching for a single lost grain of sand in a desert. The truck, Arthur's old Ford pickup, remained a key missing piece of the puzzle. Without it, they couldn't even begin to guess where he might have gone or what might have happened. Then, about 3 weeks after Arthur was last seen, the breakthrough came, completely by chance. A young couple, out on a Sunday drive, had decided to explore a less-traveled dirt road that twisted deep into the rugged hills bordering the county line. They were looking for a scenic spot for a picnic, a place away from the usual crowds. As they navigated a particularly steep and winding section, the road narrowed, barely more than a track, and then suddenly opened into a small, secluded clearing. Tucked away among some dense scrub oak and shadowed by a towering rock formation, they saw it. An old, dusty Ford pickup. Its faded green paint was barely visible under a thick layer of grime and dry leaves. The couple, new to the area, didn't immediately connect the truck to the missing rancher. They just thought it was abandoned. But something about its isolated location, so far from any habitation, struck them as odd. The man, a practical sort, decided to take a closer look. As he approached, he noticed the license plate, still attached and caked with dirt. He wiped some of the dust away and saw the numbers. He remembered hearing about the missing rancher on the local radio station, the description of his truck often mentioned. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He hurried back to his car, and they drove straight to the nearest telephone, which was at a gas station about 10 miles back down the road. Sheriff Brody received the call late that afternoon. The dispatcher, her voice tight with urgency, relayed the information. A pickup matching Arthur Finch's description, found in a remote canyon off a forgotten road. Brody felt a surge of adrenaline, mixed with a chilling sense of foreboding. He immediately gathered his deputies, and they set out, following the young couple's directions. The drive was long and bumpy, the road deteriorating the further they went. It was almost dark by the time they reached the clearing. There it was, just as described, Arthur Finch's pickup truck. The condition of the truck immediately told them a story of abandonment, not wreckage. It wasn't crashed or damaged in any obvious way. The tires were flat, sunk slightly into the soft earth, suggesting it had been there for a while. The driver's side door was ajar, swinging slightly in the evening breeze, as if someone had just stepped out for a moment. But no one was around. The engine was cold to the touch. Brody approached cautiously, his senses on high alert. He peered into the cab. The interior was dusty, but otherwise undisturbed. On the dashboard, he saw a worn leather work glove and a crumpled road map. On the seat, a half-empty thermos, still containing traces of cold coffee, and a small, well-used wrench. The keys were in the ignition. This detail struck Brody as particularly strange. Arthur was a careful man. He wouldn't leave his keys. It suggested either a hasty departure or an expectation of returning very soon. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass. nothing to indicate a violent encounter. The truck seemed to have been simply parked there and left. They checked the bed of the truck. It contained a few standard ranching tools, a shovel, some coiled rope, a small toolbox, all neatly arranged. Nothing seemed to be missing, nothing out of place. The gas tank was nearly empty, suggesting Arthur had been running low on fuel when he stopped. But why here, in this desolate spot? It was miles from his ranch, and not on any direct route to anywhere he usually went. The immediate questions raised by the truck's location and condition swirled in Brody's mind. Why had Arthur driven all the way out here? Was it an accident, a breakdown, and then he simply walked off? Or was there something more sinister at play, something that had happened after he left the vehicle? The fact that the keys were in the ignition and the door was open spoke volumes. It wasn't a planned departure. It was as if Arthur had stepped out for a moment, expecting to get right back in. But he never did. The remote canyon, silent and vast under the deepening twilight, offered no answers, only more questions that echoed in the growing darkness. The discovery of the truck, while a significant breakthrough, only served to deepen the unsettling mystery of Arthur Finch's disappearance. The canyon where Arthur Finch's truck was found was a place of wild, untamed beauty, but also of unforgiving harshness. It was a deep gash in the earth, carved over millennia by a forgotten river, now mostly dry except for a trickle during the wet season. The walls rose steeply, a patchwork of reddish-brown rock faces, loose scree, and stubborn scrub brush. Pinon pines clung precariously to ledges, their dark green contrasting with the pale, sun-baked stone. Cacti and other desert plants, spiky and resilient, dotted the canyon floor, making walking a treacherous affair. This particular spot, where the truck rested, was a small, relatively flat clearing, far from any established road. It was accessible only by a rough, barely visible track that snaked down from the mesa above, a track probably used only by hunters or very adventurous hikers. The air here was thin and dry, carrying the scent of dust and distant sage. During the day, the sun beat down relentlessly, heating the rocks until they shimmered. At night, the temperature dropped sharply, making the canyon a cold, lonely place. There was a profound quietness to it, broken only by the rustle of a lizard or the occasional cry of a bird of prey circling high above. It was isolated, remote, and offered countless places for a person to simply vanish. With the discovery of the truck, the search strategy shifted dramatically. No longer were they just looking for a general missing person. Now they had a specific, albeit vast, area to focus on. Sheriff Brody immediately understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a rancher who wandered off. This was a man whose vehicle was deliberately driven to a remote, difficult location and abandoned. He contacted state authorities, requesting additional resources. Within days, the quiet canyon was swarming with activity. More deputies arrived, along with a team of professional search and rescue personnel from the nearest state park, and even a few trained trackers who knew the local terrain like the back of their hands. Search dogs, mostly German shepherds and bloodhounds, were brought in, their keen noses working overtime, trying to pick up Arthur's scent from the truck and track it into the wilderness. They fanned out in ever-widening circles from the abandoned vehicle, their handlers guiding them through the thorny underbrush and over the uneven ground. Aerial surveys were also attempted, though they were primitive by today's standards. A small, single-engine plane, typically used for crop dusting, was chartered to fly low over the canyon and the surrounding mesas. The pilot, squinting through binoculars, looked for any disturbance in the landscape, a glint of metal, a patch of unusual color, anything that might indicate Arthur's presence. However, the challenges of the terrain quickly became apparent. The canyon walls were steep and treacherous, making it easy for someone to fall or get disoriented. Deep crevices and hidden caves offered countless places to hide, or to be hidden. The dense vegetation, while not jungle-like, was thick enough in places to obscure a person just a few feet away. The sheer scale of the area was overwhelming. Even with dozens of searchers, the canyon felt endless. Every rock, every shadow, every cluster of bushes had to be meticulously checked. The searchers faced not only the physical demands of the harsh environment, but also a growing psychological toll. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Arthur Finch. The sun beat down, dehydrating them, and the cold nights made rest difficult. Hope, initially high, began to wane with each passing day. The dogs would occasionally pick up a scent, leading the teams on grueling chases up steep inclines or through dense thickets, only for the trail to vanish or lead to a dead end. The aerial surveys, too, yielded nothing but endless stretches of rock and scrub. The lack of any definitive clue was agonizing. Was Arthur injured and hiding somewhere, unable to call for help? Had he fallen and succumbed to the elements? Or was there something more sinister at play? The environment allowed for all these possibilities. A simple misstep could lead to a fatal fall. Getting lost in such a desolate place, without water or supplies, could prove deadly. But the careful abandonment of the truck, with the keys in the ignition and the door ajar, kept nagging at Brody. It didn't feel like a simple accident. It felt like Arthur had left the vehicle with purpose, or had been forced to leave it. The canyon, silent and ancient, held its secrets close, offering no easy answers to the questions that plagued everyone involved in the search. The vast, indifferent wilderness seemed to mock their efforts, swallowing Arthur Finch whole, leaving only his abandoned truck as a haunting monument to his disappearance. With the extensive search efforts in the canyon yielding no results, law enforcement had to shift their focus. The wilderness had given up no clues, and the initial theories of an accidental fall or getting lost were beginning to feel less likely, given the sheer amount of ground that had been covered. It was time to look beyond the immediate physical evidence and delve into Arthur Finch's life itself. Investigators, led by Sheriff Brody, began to meticulously piece together Arthur's movements in the days and weeks leading up to his disappearance. This meant countless interviews, not just with his ranch hands and neighbors, but with anyone who might have had contact with him. They spoke to the general store owner in the nearest small town, who remembered Arthur buying feed and supplies just a few days before he vanished. The owner described Arthur as his usual quiet, straightforward self, nothing out of the ordinary. The local bank manager confirmed that Arthur's accounts were in good standing, dispelling any immediate concerns about financial distress. There were no large withdrawals or suspicious transactions. Brody interviewed Arthur's few relatives, mostly distant cousins who lived in neighboring counties. They described him as a man dedicated to his ranch, a bit of a loner, but always fair and honest. None of them could recall any recent arguments or worries that might have driven him away. The investigators also looked into any known disputes Arthur might have had. Ranching life, especially in those days, could sometimes lead to disagreements over land boundaries, water rights, or cattle. However, every person interviewed said Arthur was not a man to pick fights. He resolved issues calmly and was respected for his integrity. There were no ongoing feuds that anyone could point to. They checked the local bars and diners, places where gossip often flowed freely, but even there, Arthur's name only came up in hushed tones of concern, never suspicion. Everyone seemed to genuinely like and respect him. As the news of the abandoned truck and the fruitless canyon search spread, tips began to trickle in from the public. Each one, no matter how outlandish, had to be followed up. A woman from a town 2 hours away called to say she saw a man who looked like Arthur hitchhiking on the highway. Deputies were dispatched, but the man was long gone, and there was no way to verify if it was indeed Arthur. Another tip suggested he might have been seen in a neighboring state buying a bus ticket. This lead also went nowhere, as bus station records from that era were often spotty and unreliable. One particular tip came from a traveling salesman who claimed he saw Arthur talking to two unfamiliar men in a black sedan outside a roadside diner about a week before he disappeared. The salesman remembered the men seemed agitated, but he couldn't make out what they were saying. He described them as city types, not locals. This lead was pursued diligently. Brody sent out descriptions of the men and the car to other law enforcement agencies, but without a license plate number or a clearer description, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. The salesman had only seen them for a few minutes, preoccupied with his own order. It was a tantalizing hint, suggesting something beyond a simple accident, but it led to a dead end. Days turned into weeks, and then months. The initial flurry of activity slowed to a crawl. The leads were exhausted, one by one. Each potential sighting, every whisper of a rumor, was investigated and ultimately dismissed. The frustration in the sheriff's office grew palpable. They had a missing man, an abandoned truck in a remote location, and absolutely no concrete evidence to explain what happened. There were no signs of a struggle in or around the truck, no blood, no footprints, other than Arthur's own leading away from the vehicle for a short distance before vanishing on the rocky ground. There was no ransom note, no indication of a robbery. The absence of any definitive answers began to weigh heavily on everyone involved. The case was growing cold, and Brody knew it. He had done everything by the book, used all the resources available to him in that time, but the wilderness and the silence of the people had defeated him. The prevailing sense of mystery was like a thick fog that refused to lift. Was it an accident, despite the lack of a body? Was it foul play, despite the lack of evidence? Or had Arthur Finch simply decided to walk away from his life, leaving everything behind? The idea seemed out of character for the grounded rancher, but without any other explanation, it remained a possibility, however remote. The silence of the canyon and the vastness of the empty landscape felt like a conspiracy, guarding its secrets with an impenetrable resolve. The case of Arthur Finch became a lingering question mark in the minds of the community, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. The years began to stack up, one after another, since Arthur Finch disappeared. What started as a frantic search and a focused investigation gradually faded into a quiet, persistent ache in the community's memory. The active case files were eventually moved from Brody's desk to a dusty shelf in the back room, marked with the ominous label, "Cold Case." The once fresh leads had long since gone stale, and the hopes of finding Arthur alive, or even finding definitive answers, dwindled with each passing season. The canyon where his truck was found remained mostly unchanged, a silent monument to an unsolved riddle. Its rugged beauty now held a darker meaning for those who knew the story. A place where a man simply vanished. The landscape itself continued its slow, indifferent transformation. The dirt roads leading to the canyon, once churned by search vehicles, returned to their natural state, overgrown with weeds and less frequently traveled. The small town that had buzzed with speculation and worry eventually settled back into its rhythms, but Arthur Finch's absence left a permanent, subtle scar. Children born after 1958 grew up hearing whispers of the rancher who disappeared, a local legend told around campfires and whispered among old-timers. For them, it was almost a myth, a cautionary tale about the vastness and unforgiving nature of the wilderness that surrounded them. But for the older residents, especially those who had known Arthur, the memory was sharp and painful. They still talked about him sometimes, usually when something reminded them of the rancher's sturdy build or his quiet demeanor. They'd remember his specific way of tipping his hat or a particular story he'd told. These conversations often ended with the same helpless shrug, the same unanswered question hanging in the air. His ranch, once a vibrant hub of activity, slowly fell into disrepair. The fields he had meticulously tended became wild, the fences broken, the barn paint peeling. It stood as a stark reminder of a life abruptly interrupted, a silent testament to the man who was no longer there. Arthur's family bore the heaviest burden of this enduring mystery. His wife, who had held on to hope with fierce determination in the early days, eventually had to accept the grim reality of his absence. The legal complications of a missing person, declared legally dead after a certain number of years, compounded their emotional pain. They lived with the uncertainty, the nagging questions, the endless what-ifs. Every stranger they saw, every distant rumor, sparked a brief, agonizing flicker of hope, only to be extinguished by the passage of time and the lack of concrete evidence. The children grew up without their father, carrying the weight of an unresolved past, forever wondering what had truly happened to him. Looking back, the limitations of the past were glaringly obvious. In the mid-20th century, forensic science was in its infancy compared to today. There was no DNA analysis, no sophisticated digital tracking, no widespread use of satellite imagery. Investigations relied heavily on physical evidence that could be seen, touched, or directly reported by witnesses. Communication was slower. Records were often paper-based and easily lost or incomplete. A small, rural sheriff's department like Brody's had even fewer resources. They worked with what they had: boots on the ground, local knowledge, and an unwavering commitment to their community. Had Arthur Finch disappeared today, the story might have unfolded very differently. Modern techniques could have processed even the smallest trace evidence from the truck or the surrounding area. Cell phone records, if he had one, could have pinpointed his last known location. Surveillance cameras, ubiquitous in many areas now, might have captured his movements. But in 1958, such tools were the stuff of science fiction. Brody and his deputies were left to sift through dust and rumors, their efforts ultimately hampered by the vastness of the land and the technological constraints of their era. The case, therefore, became ingrained in the local folklore, a unique blend of fact and speculation. It was a story told and retold, each telling adding a new layer of mystery. Was he taken? Did he run away? Did he meet with an accident that left no trace? The questions became rhetorical, almost part of the landscape itself. The canyon, once just a remote geological feature, was now synonymous with the unsolved disappearance of Arthur Finch. It represented the secrets the wild could keep, the way nature could swallow a man whole and leave no sign. Over the decades, as new families moved into the area and old ones passed on, the details of the story might have blurred, but the core mystery remained. Arthur Finch was a man who went to work one day and simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only a truck and a lingering question. The case served as a stark reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly a person could vanish from the known world, leaving behind only a phantom presence in the memories of those who loved him. The silence of the canyon held its secrets close, defying every attempt to unravel them, ensuring that Arthur Finch's fate would remain one of the community's most enduring and haunting enigmas. Despite the passage of many years, the story of Arthur Finch never truly faded. It became a piece of local history, whispered around campfires and mentioned in hushed tones whenever a new resident inquired about the old, abandoned ranch near the canyon. For a long time, it seemed like the case was permanently closed, an unsolved mystery destined to remain so. But then, decades after Arthur vanished, a new glimmer of hope appeared, not in the form of a dramatic breakthrough, but through a quiet, persistent effort to revisit the past. It began with Arthur's granddaughter, Clara. Born long after his disappearance, Clara had grown up hearing fragmented stories about her grandfather, a man she only knew through faded photographs and the wistful memories of her grandmother. As an adult, Clara became a local history enthusiast, spending her free time digging through old newspaper archives and county records. The mystery of her grandfather's disappearance became a personal quest, a way to connect with a family history that felt incomplete. She wasn't looking for sensationalism, just answers, or at least a clearer understanding of what might have happened. Clara's research led her to the dusty files of the local sheriff's office. Many of the original deputies were long gone, but the records, though sparse by modern standards, still existed. She spent weeks poring over handwritten notes, faded witness statements, and the few photographs taken of the truck in the canyon. It was tedious work, but she approached it with a calm determination. She noticed small details that might have been overlooked or simply not understood in the urgency of the initial search. One particular detail caught her eye: a brief mention in a deputy's report about a peculiar rock formation near where the truck was found. The report dismissed it as irrelevant, just part of the canyon's natural landscape. But Clara, having spent her childhood exploring similar canyons, knew how easy it was for natural features to hide things, especially after decades of shifting earth and vegetation growth. She decided to visit the site herself, armed with old maps and a new perspective. The canyon looked much different than it did in 1958. Parts of the old access road were overgrown, and the landscape had been subtly reshaped by erosion and time. But after hours of careful searching, comparing landmarks from the old photos to her surroundings, Clara found the spot where the truck had been discovered. And there, partially obscured by a thicket of brush, was the peculiar rock formation mentioned in the report. It wasn't just a rock. It was a small, almost hidden alcove, barely large enough for a person to squeeze into. Inside, the alcove was cool and dry. As Clara carefully explored its dusty interior, she found nothing dramatic, no bones or personal effects. But she did find something else, something that sparked a new thought. A small, weathered piece of canvas, torn and snagged on a sharp edge of rock. It was too small to identify immediately, but it looked like a fragment from a tent or a tarp. Why would it be there, and why hadn't it been found before? It was a tiny clue, easily dismissed, but it was enough to make Clara wonder if Arthur had perhaps sought shelter there, or if someone else had. This small discovery, combined with her re-examination of the original reports, started to shift Clara's thinking. The initial investigation had focused heavily on the idea of an accident or an intentional disappearance. But what if Arthur had encountered someone else in the canyon? The canvas fragment, if it was indeed from a temporary shelter, suggested a human presence that wasn't Arthur's, or perhaps it was his, and he had been camping or attempting to repair something before something unexpected happened. Clara also found inconsistencies in some of the witness statements, not major ones, but small discrepancies in times or descriptions that, when viewed through a modern lens, suggested misunderstandings rather than deliberate deception. For example, one witness claimed to have seen Arthur driving his truck on a road leading away from the canyon, hours after another witness reported him heading towards it. In 1958, these conflicting accounts might have been attributed to faulty memory or simple confusion. But Clara started to consider the possibility of a second vehicle, or even a second person. The unproven theories surrounding Arthur's disappearance had always been varied. The most common one was that he had suffered an accident in the rugged terrain, a fall, a sudden illness, or exposure to the elements, and his body was simply never found. The canyon was vast and unforgiving, perfectly capable of hiding a person indefinitely. Another theory, whispered among some, was that he had chosen to disappear, to start a new life away from the ranch and its responsibilities. This felt less likely to Clara, given what she knew of his character and his deep ties to the land. Then there was the darker theory, foul play. But there had never been any evidence of a struggle, no blood, no signs of violence at the truck or anywhere nearby. The canvas fragment, however, introduced a new angle. What if Arthur had met someone in the canyon, perhaps a prospector, a drifter, or even someone he knew? The canyon was remote, a place where people could easily go unnoticed. A chance encounter, a dispute, or an act of desperation could have led to a tragic outcome, one that left no obvious trace for the limited investigative tools of the time. Clara's work didn't solve the mystery unequivocally. She didn't find Arthur, nor did she uncover a confession, but she did manage to reframe the questions. Her meticulous re-examination of the old evidence, combined with her own exploration of the canyon, suggested that the narrative might be more complex than a simple accident or intentional vanishing. The canvas fragment, the peculiar rock formation, and the small inconsistencies in witness accounts all hinted at a possible human element that had been overlooked. It was a small shift, but it was enough to stir the waters of a decades-old cold case, reminding everyone that even the most enduring mysteries can still offer up new, tantalizing clues. The canyon still guarded its secrets, but now, thanks to Clara, there was a slightly clearer picture of what those secrets might involve. The ultimate lack of a definitive answer regarding Arthur's fate remained. Despite Clara's dedicated efforts to re-examine the historical records and her own physical exploration of the canyon, the exact circumstances of his disappearance in 1958 were still shrouded in uncertainty. This unclosed chapter continued to cast a long shadow, not just over the surviving members of Arthur's family, but also over the small, close-knit community that had known him. The profound impact of unresolved disappearances was a heavy weight, a constant reminder of the human need for closure, which, in this case, clashed starkly with the harsh reality of cold cases. For his family, the absence was a daily presence. His children, now elderly, had grown up without their father, always carrying the quiet ache of not knowing. They had endured the initial frantic searches, the gradual fading of hope, and the slow, painful transition from active investigation to a cold case file. The ranch, once a vibrant hub of activity under Arthur's steady hand, had changed ownership, though its fields and fences still bore the faint imprint of his labor. His memory wasn't just that of a missing person, it was the memory of the individual he was, a hard-working rancher, a pillar of his community, a man who loved his land. The physical remnants of his life, a sturdy barn, a weathered fence post, a particular grove of trees he had planted, all stood as silent witnesses to his absence, echoing the questions that had never been answered. Clara's research, while not providing a definitive solution, had given the family something they hadn't had in decades, a renewed sense of purpose and a slightly altered understanding of the possibilities. The canvas fragment, the peculiar rock formation, and the re-evaluation of old witness statements had all reopened avenues of thought that had long been considered closed. It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless, to know that the mystery was still being considered, still being actively pondered, even after so many years. The rancher, Arthur, was remembered in various ways. To his immediate family, he was a loving father and husband. Stolen away too soon. To the older residents of the town, he was a respected neighbor, a man of his word, and a part of the landscape itself. To newcomers, he was a local legend, the subject of whispered stories and cautionary tales. His story had become woven into the fabric of the community, a poignant reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of the unknown. The annual community picnic, an event Arthur had always helped organize, often included a moment of quiet reflection, a silent acknowledgement of the man who had simply vanished. The physical landscape of the canyon itself, where Arthur's truck had been found, remained largely unchanged. Its rugged beauty and unforgiving terrain continued to hold its secrets close. Time had moved on, bringing new technologies, new roads, and new faces to the region, but the canyon stood as a timeless sentinel. Its vastness and its capacity to conceal were as potent now as they had been in 1958. It was a place that offered solace to some and evoked dread in others, a natural monument to the enduring mystery it contained. Clara's investigation concluded without a definitive answer, but with a deeper understanding of the questions. She recognized that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, and that sometimes the true legacy lies in the asking, in the refusal to forget. The case of the vanished rancher, Arthur, became a powerful illustration of the nature of disappearance and the relentless march of time. It highlighted how, despite human ingenuity and perseverance, some questions, despite all efforts and the passage of generations, may never receive a definitive answer. The American landscape, in its raw and untamed glory, still held its secrets, and Arthur's story was one of its most compelling. It served as a powerful, silent testament to the countless untold stories hidden within its vast expanse. A reminder that some journeys end in silence, leaving only echoes and an enduring sense of wonder. The rancher, his truck and the canyon had become entwined in a narrative that would forever remain incomplete, a timeless tale of a life that simply ceased to be, leaving behind an indelible mark of mystery. The wind still whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the unspoken questions, a constant, gentle hum of the unresolved.